Questions continue for Mr. McKenna. Mr. McKenna, you've been in the news recently with your financial situation in terms of your law practice here. What would you say? What would you what would you say to somebody who say this might not be the best time to run for statewide office?
It's the best time because I am the only one at this table that makes a sacrifice for the Constitution. When you have a corrupt workers' compensation system, you got to stand up for it. I stood up for it. I stood up for the depositors. I stood up against Frank Williams. I stood up against George Healy. These gentlemen here have not one of them, have dedicated a dime of their money or their effort to reform Rhode Island. I've stood up to the press. I've stood up to the media. You know, on this mortgage banking thing, who makes the money? The Providence Journal. Who's not covering it? The Providence Journal. Who is challenging it? The Providence. I am Kevin McKenna. I am the candidate who has the guts to stand up to special interests. Nobody else here has. That's what that's about.
Mr. Wallen.
We just talked a moment ago about the stresses and the financial condition that the Attorney General's budget is going to be in. It's a $24 million budget. We're likely to face a 15% reduction. Mr. McKenna, of course, has filed both personally and his law practice bankruptcy, and that's not the kind of leadership that we're going to need in the Attorney General's office. I do find it offensive, his suggestion that I've never taken an effort to do anything to serve the people, especially in light of the fact that I raised my hand and served this country as a captain in an Air Force JAG.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmartin.
Thank you. You know, Kevin did bring up a good point about Beacon Mutual. They do have a large amount of reserves. But there is one thing the Attorney General can immediately do. When they go for increases in rates, you go in and you fight them. And you make sure that those reserves go back to the very businesses that have paid into them. That's how you keep the cost down with business. That's what you do with those issues. And that's the role of the Attorney General, to advocate when all of these insurance increases are going through. And Beacon Mutual is one place where we can save money for business.
Mr. Rainville.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, Kevin has certainly worked many years as an attorney in this state, and I have great respect for the efforts and the work that he's done. But I wish and hope, and at this point in time, I'm running as an independent, and I'd love Kevin to back my candidacy up and support me. Maybe it's not the best time personally, but again, he's worked for this state and for many of the constituents here for many years. He actually was on the Constitutional Convention with my father, the late Bob Rainville, and they did some great work at that Constitutional Convention. So I would ask that Kevin, if it is a difficult personal time, that he would support my candidacy as the independent for Attorney General.
Thanks, Mr. Rainville. Mr. Little.
The budget this year, Peter, the budget that was passed has 126 people with 231.5 full-time equivalents. It is a challenging task, and yes, indeed, you should have some management expertise and the confidence of the public if you're going to implement the job. I think more importantly what we see here is, I think the role of the Attorney General is to follow the law if the Attorney General is to enforce the law. And if one is ordered to do something by a court, one should follow the order of the court. And I think that is an issue here that we should keep in mind.
Mr. McKenna.
The order of the court, if it's unconstitutional, you should challenge it. The first duty of the Attorney General is to the people, not to the insiders. You're not pandering to judges. You're not pandering to insiders. I have focused my entire life making sacrifices to help people and standing up to insiders. The proceedings under Chapter 11, I made $500,000. It's not about money. It's about the restraining order. I could have paid $4,000 to a crook who didn't have a hearing, but I did not. I want to stand up for principle. I want to stand up for
Thanks, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to turn to Arlene Violet. Question for Eric Wallen.
Mr. Wallen, the legislature recently passed all this good time legislation. You can get 10 days off a month, another 5 days if you go out on work release, another 5 days or so if you attend classes, etc. Recently, a woman who killed someone while she was drunk driving got a 5-year sentence that made her eligible, as you know, in a year and 8 months, potentially for parole. But she also picked up 446 days off her sentence. So in effect, killing somebody after a drunk driving conviction, she ended up in effect having like 6.5 months for killing someone. Police officers say the repeat offenders are back out there on the streets. The correction officers are telling me they see the same people over and over again coming back through the gates. Would you repeal that law?
Well, I certainly would love to repeal the law, except I won't be a legislator. Peter Kilmartin actually voted for that law that gives the good time and failed to repeal an existing law at the same time, which he could have, failed to put legislation in to repeal the law that gives sex offenders good time off, which they still get. I raised that issue in this campaign because I think it's critical and important. We need to do away with good time for violent offenders. We need to do away with good time for domestic abusers, and we need to do away with good time for sex offenders.
Mr. Kilmartin.
Thank you. Well, first, let me say what he's referring to was a law that was passed in 1976 prior to my being at the General Assembly. Number two, the Good Time Bill was actually put together by national experts using Council of State Governments and other groups for best practices. But I did put a bill in.
Yeah,
So
but
we
you
could
voted for the
review it.
bill. You voted for the bill. In retrospect, now that you've seen what has happened with that good time, would you support efforts to repeal it?
I actually put the bill in to repeal it, to see if it's working. And
But you voted for it, sir. You voted for it in the
because-
Judiciary Committee, and then
No,
it
I
went
didn't vote-
over.
I'm not on the
Yes, you did. It
Judiciary
was this,
Committee.
well, you voted for it when it was a standalone bill, and then of
Yes.
course it got passed as part of the budget.
Because
but
one of
you
the
voted for it.
because
When
one of
did
the
you-
one of the alternatives, if I may explain this, is there were proposals to close whole wings of the ACI without any mechanism in place to put people out into the public. We had to do it in a reasoned, thoughtful manner without a
I'm going
wholesale.
to stop you right there. Thank you, Mr. Kilmartin. Mr. Rainville, sorry.
Well, as Representative Kilmartin said before, talk is cheap. There's always political ways to excuse and explain reasons for doing things and taking votes. As your Attorney General, independent Attorney General, I will be very clear. I talk to people around the state. I look them in the eye, and I'm honest. I will make every effort and support every effort to repeal that law. We need to have the tools in place to work and to punish the people that need to be punished so they are not continually getting out on the streets. We have repeat offenses, Arlene, because we have people that are getting out. They're continually going in and out of the system. So once we punish someone, we need to keep them there and not have political talk
Thank
back
you.
and forth.
Mr. Little.
The issue of repeat offenders is a significant problem in our prison. And it kind of reminds me of a story that somebody told me that in the context of the fact that we spend more money on our prisons than we do on higher education. And on top of that, the alums from our prison return to campus far more often than they do to our colleges. It's a telling story, and I think the point, yes, we should go back to some legislative changes to try to tighten that up, because in this example you cited is just a gross example of the kind of situation we should not be tolerating.
Thanks, Mr. Little. Mr. McKenna.
The predator stuff is just fair pandering. What we need is a Department of Attorney General that controls the system. The judicial system, the judicial enforcement system, the criminal justice system should be one system. $22 million in overtime at the Department of Corrections is almost as much as the budget of the Attorney General, which is $23 million. If the Attorney General was responsible for the Department of Attorney General, the Bureau of the Children's Training School, the Boys Training School, we could make a difference.
Thank you, Mr. McKenna. I turn to my colleague Jim Hummel of the Hummel Report. Question for Representative Kilmartin.
Representative Kilmartin, I did a story in January for the Hummel Report concerning Mayor Moreau. And there was a picture of the sitting Attorney General, the Secretary of State, you, Mayor Moreau, and a sitting Central Falls councilwoman. You were at his headquarters the night he was elected. Certainly not begrudging you at all being there for a friend and a political ally. However, the sitting Attorney General was there who had made contributions to Mayor Moreau's campaign, and he was also standing alongside with you a woman who had been charged with drunk driving, and the charges were still pending. Had you been the Attorney General, would you be standing in that picture? And is it appropriate for an Attorney General to be supporting somebody both financially and politically?
I'm glad you asked that question. First, let me say I did not even know that councilwoman when that picture was taken.
I'm not
I got
begrudging
introduced-
you as a
Okay.
representative. I'm talking about as an Attorney General.
As an Attorney General, I've already made the commitment I would not donate to any political candidates because of that very reason. That way no one can say, oh, he's got a friend, he's supporting him. So I've made that commitment that I would not be doing any of that campaign contribution to political
Was it wrong
people.
for Attorney General Lynch to be standing there with basically, in effect, the defendant in the case?
I wouldn't have done it.
So it was wrong for him. You would not have done it if you were sitting in his position.
It would be wrong for me.
Okay, great.
Mr. Rainville.
Well, Peter likes to say, you know, I wouldn't have done this, wouldn't have. You can't unring the bell. He was there. I'm not sure how well he knew that woman or not, but the perception of the Attorney General needs to be absolutely clear that they are above any type of politics. I will not have, certainly not give any donations when you're Attorney General. I will have zero involvement with the political machine that Rep. Kilmartin has been involved in or has been part of for the last 20 years. You cannot have anyone as the Attorney General having any kind of perception of in politics.
Mr. Little.
I think what we see is an example of the problem of having one party that has been in power too long, and we see the example of what has come up with a level of corruption or a level of relationship that seems to be an accepted norm. And at the very least, it creates the perception that there is something wrong. You can't do this job unless you have the confidence of the public.
Mr. McKenna?
I disagree with the notion that there's anything wrong about politics. I admire Representative Kilmartin for paying attention to Central Falls. Central Falls is 1 mile square of poverty. People need to pay attention to that place. He should be congratulated for being there and trying to help out.
Mr. Wallen.
What this highlights is the fact that, again, we've had powerful political politicians in the Attorney General's office for far too long. It's time that we get away from that. Somebody who has been in the General Assembly for 20 years simply has too many political connections, too many favors, too many contributors, and too much baggage to have the confidence of the people of the state of Rhode Island that they will, in fact, act as a watchdog over their friends that they've served with in the General Assembly, as well as fellow party members throughout the municipal government.
What do you think, Mr. Kilmartin?
Again, I'm the only one here who swore with his right hand to uphold the law without fear or favor and did so. And my friend Chris Little here, he's part of the norm. He and members of the Oldberg Corporation donated to Mayor Moreau. And then Oldberg Corporation got the Wyatt Detention Center contract to build the addition there.